दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना। दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना। ईमान में वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क वफा रखना। ईमान में वक्त से एक रिश्ता।
Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu, and welcome back to another episode of Friday Sermon for Kids. Today, I am once again joined by two incredible panelists, Haris, who you may recognize from previous episodes, and we have a new face today, Areeb. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum assalam, Farhan bhai. I'm really excited to discuss this week's Friday Sermon with both of you.
Wa alaikum assalam, Farhan bhai. I'm very excited as well.
I love the energy from both of you. Now, Huzoor talked about a very fascinating topic in his Friday sermon, and I think it would be very interesting to discuss it.
Huzoor talked about two expeditions, one that took place 4 years after Hijrah, and the other that took place 5 years after Hijrah. And those are what we're going to be discussing, right?
Exactly. Now, before we do discuss those two expeditions, I think it's a good idea to listen to a clip from this week's Friday sermon.
आज दो ग़ज़वात का ज़िक्र करूँगा। पहले ग़ज़वे का नाम है ग़ज़वा बदरुल मौइद, जो 4 हिजरी में हुआ। ये ग़ज़वा बदरुल मौइद, बदरुल सानिया, बदरुल आखिरा और बदरुल सुग़रा के नामों से मारूफ़ है।
After listening to Huzoor's clip, I know for a fact I'm ready for today's discussion. But before we do that, I want to do one more thing, and that is I want to know what both of you learned from this week's Friday sermon.
Something that I learned from this week's Friday Sermon was when Abu Sufyan challenged the Muslims for a fight after the Battle of Uhud. He spread out fake rumors that he's going to come out more prepared and with more power. But he tried to scare the Muslims, but his whole attempt failed.
I learned that even Abu Sufyan was scared of the complete trust the Holy Prophet ﷺ had in Allah.
Well done to the both of you. I love that you listened to the Friday sermon and took these points out. Now, without further ado, let's get into this discussion.
Farhan bhai, I remember this one expedition Huzoor mentioned, Badr Muid. Can we talk further into that?
Absolutely. Now, Huzoor mentioned that this expedition took place in the 4th year after Hijrah. Huzoor mentioned that this event started off when Abu Sufyan decided after the Battle of Uhud, after he was returning to Mecca, that he would say, next year we shall fight again. And he said this to the Muslims. The Holy Prophet ﷺ told Hazrat Umar, reply to him and say, Inshallah, God willing. And that was a sort of testament to say that, yeah, we'll come and fight with you. And so Huzoor mentioned that Abu Sufyan said this out of arrogance. So naturally, because of his arrogance, when the time came to actually fight, he was very scared. Now, funnily enough, as Abu Sufyan was sort of shaking in his boots, he tried to make it seem as though he was putting together a very vast and powerful Meccan army, He wanted to scare the Muslims. He wanted to tell them, I'm ready to fight you guys. But interestingly enough, this was obviously false. Huzoor, may Allah be his helper, also quoted Hazrat Mirza Bashir Ahmad anhu, who stated that to add to this effect of developing fear in the Muslims, Abu Sufyan hired an individual named Nuaym, and he awarded him 20 camels. Now what his task is to go to the Muslims and pretty much scare them even more. What he was trying to do was say that, Abu Sufyan has such a strong army. He has so many weapons, so many camels, so many horses. My recommendation is don't fight. Just back away, please. For your sake, back away. Now, of course, this scared some Muslims. Some Muslims with weaker faith actually backed away. Now, interestingly enough, Huzoor mentioned that this was when the Holy Prophet ﷺ re-motivated the Muslims and re-energized them by saying that even if no one stands with me to fight the Meccans, I will go myself and fight them. And this was more than enough to motivate the Muslims to go out and fight alongside the Holy Prophet.
Wait, so does that mean the Muslims had to fight another battle after Uhud? Wouldn't that be risky considering the Muslims just fought?
Yeah, I was thinking the same thing. How could the Muslims possibly fight the Quraysh after the Battle of Uhud?
You know, that's a very thoughtful question. I'm glad you asked that because I think it's very important to understand the timeline. Now, the Battle of Uhud actually took place during the 7th month of the 3rd year after Hijrah. And this expedition that we're talking about right now took place during the 10th month of the 4th year after Hijrah. So, technically speaking, the Muslims had almost a year to recuperate, to sort of bring more supplies, to gain more men. And Huzoor mentioned that when the Holy Prophet ﷺ left to fight Abu Sufyan, he actually left with 1,500 men, many weapons, many camels, and many horses. And that sort of proves that the Muslims, over the course of this year, were able to resupply and grow to become an even more powerful sort of force.
Oh, okay. Now that makes a lot more sense. So the Muslims had a lot of resources that they collected over a year.
Yeah, that does make more sense. But did the Muslims even fight?
That's another very good question. I'm glad you guys are asking these very thoughtful and, discussion-worthy questions. So what the Meccans tried to do was they would say, if the Muslims didn't come to the battlefield because of their fear, their tactics worked. The Meccans would say, hey, we waited for you, you didn't even come. And the second plan that the Meccans decided was, if they actually did come out to fight, what would be our excuse? Our excuse would be this. We'll say that we are experiencing a very severe famine. Our people are struggling. We don't have money. So let's just delay the fight. Now, Huzoor mentioned that, of course, the Muslims weren't going to back away from this fight. They promised. So the Holy Prophet ﷺ left out with a force of 1,500 with a bunch of weapons, a bunch of camels, horses, and Abu Sufyan left with 2,000 of his own men. Now, by God's power, the Muslims reached Badr just as they had promised. As Abu Sufyan was leaving, he actually found out about the power and the sheer force that the Muslims were coming to fight him with. He's like, oh man, these people are serious. So what he's decided to do was to cover up that failure of him not wanting to fight. He actually turned around. And so what he said to his fellow soldiers, we're experiencing a famine. I don't think it's a very good idea that we waste resources on these Muslims. Let's wait till this famine is over. Let's collect our resources and let's go fight them another time. And now, I know you both are probably wondering, the Muslims came out with such a strong force. Why did they not fight? This seems like a little bit of a waste of time. Now, Huzoor mentioned that this entire expedition proved to be very, very rewarding for the Muslims. And the reason why is because the Holy Prophet ﷺ stayed at Badr for another 8 days. And during these 8 days, there was actually a carnival that took place. During this carnival, the Muslims had the opportunity to trade and to sort of be a part of business. During these trading attempts and this business opportunity, the Muslims were actually able to double their original sort of wealth. They were able to accumulate that much money over that 8 days. So technically speaking, this was a very beneficial sort of expedition for the Muslims.
That's awesome. So the Muslims were able to show that they were a force not to be reckoned with while also making a ton of money in the process. I think that's a win-win, in my opinion.
Oh, I definitely agree with what you said, Haris. Now, I think it's a very good time to take a little bit of a break before we start our next discussion point. So for that, I want to ask Samir to help us better understand Huzoor's words. So Samir, take it away, my friend.
Jazakallah, guys. This week's word of the sermon is Lashkar. This is an Urdu word which means an army or military force. This term is often used in military contexts or historical references to armies. Huzoor, may Allah be his helper, uses words several times in this week's Friday sermon to refer to the unit of armies Muslims and their opponents had during the expeditions. Hope that helps. Back over to you guys.
Jazakallah Samir for helping all of us better understand Huzoor's words. Now let's get back into our discussion.
Huzoor mentions the two expeditions that were in his Friday sermon. The first one was Badr Muid, and the second one was Dumatul Jandal. Is that the one we're going to be talking about?
Yes, absolutely. You're exactly right. So Huzoor started talking about this particular expedition by stating that it actually occurred during the 5th year after Hijrah in Rabiul Awwal, which is the 3rd month of the lunar calendar. Huzoor mentioned that, this expedition was for the sake of establishing peace. Now, I think it's very important to understand that the wars that the Holy Prophet ﷺ fought were not always just to defend Islam. They were also done to create order and to establish peace within that region. So this particular incident Huzoor mentions is very much that. So what happened was, the Holy Prophet ﷺ actually received news that there were people in Dumatul Jandal that were causing a lot of problems. What happened was that there were people there that were actually robbing and looting innocent passerbyers and people or that like caravans that were passing by, and it was causing a lot of problems, right? It was like people were in distress. And so what the Holy Prophet ﷺ decided to do was to go to Dumatul Jandal with 1,000 of his men and himself. Huzoor mentioned that this incident is unique in that Dumatul Jandal was actually very far away from Medina. Typically, a lot of the conflicts or wars that occurred were near Medina. This particular incident was 450 kilometers away. So it took them 15 to 16 days. This was a very long expedition. Now, Huzoor mentioned that after this very long expedition, when the Holy Prophet ﷺ got to Dumatul Jandal, the people that were actually causing problems heard of the Muslims coming and they dispersed. They dispersed in such a way that they left literally no trace of themselves. The Holy Prophet ﷺ sent out parties to search for them, but nobody could find who they were. What they did find was one farmer who they were able to capture, and this individual actually converted to Islam after that.
Wait a minute, Farhan, but they traveled for half a month just for the journey to have no benefit?
That's a good question, actually. And to be honest, Huzoor actually mentioned something about that as well. Huzoor mentioned that this journey was there to establish peace. And the Muslims were able to acquire that by traveling this far. When they got there, like I mentioned earlier, Huzoor ﷺ did disperse his men to look for these people. But they were long gone by then, right? Huzoor also mentioned that in this expedition, the Holy Prophet ﷺ was able to learn more about sort of the northern Arabian Peninsula at the time. Because they were so close to the Syrian border, they were able to learn about the occurrences in that area. They were able to learn about the people. In turn, the people were also able to understand who the Muslims were. Before this particular expedition, the Muslims were just rumors, right? They were just people that other people had been talking about. This time, with the Holy Prophet ﷺ and the rest of the Muslims being there present, the people there were able to see who these people were, understand the culture, understand the religion better. Now, this expedition wasn't just for fighting, right? I mentioned so many things right now that make this expedition actually very beneficial. So technically speaking, all in all, this expedition was very, very beneficial for the Muslims. It's also important to understand that Huzoor stated a lot of historians actually accuse the Holy Prophet ﷺ of just going there to fight, and in this attempt, he disturbed the peace. And the historians say that these people of Dumatul Jandal were far away from Medina, yes, but they assumed that the Holy Prophet ﷺ was sort of conscious about the fact that they may come to Medina and he needs to stop this attempt. And so historians say the Holy Prophet ﷺ solely took all of these men over to Dumatul Jandal just to stop this risk, right? But in reality, Huzoor mentions that this entire expedition was just for the sake of peace, right? And in fact, in this entire expedition, because there was no fighting, because the original problem was eliminated, right? The enemy was gone. The root problem was not there anymore. Peace was established, right? These accusations are refuted. These accusations that people make about this expedition is wrong. Why? Because, like I said earlier, peace was established, right?
Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Yep, same here.
Perfect. Now I think this is a very good time to sort of take a little bit of a break before we continue our discussion. So for that, we're going to go into our next segment, question of the sermon. So I hope you boys are ready. All right, we are finally at the question of the sermon. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you guys a question. I'll give you 10 seconds to think about what the answer could be, and then both of you will give me the answer, okay? All right, now here is the question. During the expedition of Badrul Mu'id, Huzoor, may Allah be his helper, mentioned that the Holy Prophet ﷺ gave the Muslim army flag to who? Option A, Hazrat Abu Bakr radhiyallahu anhu. Option B, Hazrat Umar radhiyallahu anhu. Option C, Hazrat Usman radhiyallahu anhu. Or option D, Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhu. Now, your 10 seconds to think of the answer starts now. Time's up. All right. Now, why don't you give me your answers?
I'm going with A, Hazrat Abu Bakr.
I'm going with B, Hazrat Umar.
Unfortunately, neither of you got it right. The actual right answer is option D, Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhu. So, during this expedition, Huzoor mentioned that the flag was actually given to Hazrat Ali radhiyallahu anhu, and he was the one that carried it to the battlefield. And with that, we come to the end of our discussion. I think it's a good idea to give our audience a little recap of what we discussed.
We started our discussion by talking about the Badr Mu'id, where Abu Sufyan challenged the Muslims for a fight after the Battle of Uhud, which he cowardly did not arrive for the fight.
We then discussed the expedition of Dumatul Jandal, where the Holy Prophet ﷺ received news of a group of people looting and stealing from innocent passerbys in caravans. In order to establish peace, the Holy Prophet ﷺ and 1,000 men traveled to try to end the suffering. And when the Muslims reached Dumatul Jandal, no one was there.
Yeah, exactly. And that expedition actually proved to be very fruitful for the Muslims as well. Then Huzoor mentioned the dire condition across the globe, and he mentioned that the Ahmadi Muslims should pray for everyone so that we can better follow in the footsteps of the Holy Prophet ﷺ, whose particular reason for coming to this world was also to establish peace. And again, peace is also the true meaning of Islam. And with that, we come to the end of today's episode.
Make sure to watch the full Friday sermon in your own time.
Until next time,
Khuda Hafiz.
मगर है शर्त तुमसे मुसलसल राबता रखना मगर है शर्त तुम उससे मुसलसल राबता रखना इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क़ वफ़ा रखना दिलों में प्यार की खुशबू तो होठों पर दुआ रखना इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क़ वफ़ा रखना इमाम वक्त से एक रिश्ता इश्क़ वफ़ा रखना